So I'm excited for this episode to have another conversation with Randal Rauser. We've had a number of conversations because he keeps writing books and I keep reading them. And he recently wrote a book that was dealing with progressive Christianity. And Randal, I was wondering if you would just introduce yourself and talk to us about why you wrote that book.
Sure. Thanks for having me again, Steve. It's always great to chat. So I'm a professor at Taylor Seminary, part of what's called Kairos University. I live in Edmonton, in Canada, where I've been for close to 20 years now, teaching at the seminary here, teaching theology, apologetics, write on a lot of different topics. This book, Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, came out last year, April 2022. The subtitle is A Response to Illicit Childers and the Heresy Hunters. So the book is it's a critical response to an evangelical leader named Illicit Childers, who wrote a very popular book in 2020 called Another Gospel. And in that book, she argues that progressive Christianity is an entirely different religion from Christianity. And she also makes other claims about it, such as very, I think, kind of strong rhetorical claims about how progressive Christian pastors are like wolves who want to eat the sheep. And I had a lot of concerns about the book, Another Gospel. That book has been very popular. I think at last count, it has over 3,000 reviews on Amazon. Illicit Childers has become a very high-profile speaker. She's a very popular podcast. So she's not an insignificant figure. And so I thought it was worthwhile to offer a critical response to Another Gospel, and that was the genesis of Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too.
Yeah, and I appreciated what you wrote and the tone that you took. I know I get asked fairly regularly, what do you think about progressive Christianity? And my first response is, I don't even know what you mean by that, because I find that progressive Christianity is a bit of a slippery thing as to what we actually mean by that. If you ask certain people, I think there would be people who would accuse Tim Keller of being a progressive Christian because they just don't like. He talks about justice, so therefore he must be a progressive Christian, and their heresy detectors start ringing. So, can you just kind of situate us as to what we should be thinking about in terms of progressive Christianity? Are there some sort of common boundaries that would say that this is likely to be something to do with progressive Christianity?
Sure. I think that progressive Christianity as a term is very similar to evangelicalism. When someone says, I'm an evangelical, well, you have to ask, what do you mean by that? How do you define that? And one thing you quickly find is that there is no universal agreement as to how to define evangelical. T.D. Jakes would call himself an evangelical. He's comes out of the oneness Pentecostal tradition, denying the doctrine of the Trinity. And you have others in the charismatic tradition that identify as evangelical. You also have cessationist Calvinists who reject any doctrine of supernatural sign gifts of the Holy Spirit today, who would call themselves an evangelical. And each of these groups may call the others not an evangelical. You have people that are called progressive left-wing evangelicals like Tony Campolo or Ron Sider. And so again, you're going to just find an enormous amount of diversity. It is the same thing when it comes to progressive Christian. So you have to talk to people and find out what they mean when they use the term. Now, generally speaking, when I find people using the term progressive Christian, they probably are coming out of an evangelical or more conservative or fundamentalist Protestant tradition, and they've come to critically reevaluate some of the theological doctrines and practices that they were taught growing up within that tradition. And as they begin to critique those and adopt new positions, they end up calling themselves progressive Christian because they believe that they're progressing in their understanding of Christian doctrine. Now, some of the main hallmarks where people rethink doctrines would be the doctrine of origins or understanding things like creation versus evolution. So they might have been a young earth creationist. they end up moving toward theistic evolution. They call themselves a progressive Christian. Or they move from thinking about hell as eternal conscious torment to thinking about it as resurrection to destruction, as an annihilation, or maybe even universal restoration of all people in Christ. And then they end up calling themselves progressive Christian. Probably the most controversial areas where the term progressive Christian is associated is with particular progressive social platforms. You get into things like Black Lives Matter, for example, and probably most controversial of all would be revising particular views on sexual ethics, such as the traditional prohibition of same-sex covenantal monogamous relationships. People who are progressive Christian often adopt a more inclusive understanding of those relationships. But what you have to do is you have to talk to people and understand where they are at in the spectrum and how they are using the term.
And so, thinking along those lines, then a difference between a progressive Christian and, say, a liberal Christian might be, even though their theology might be similar, very often progressive Christians are coming from that evangelical or more conservative background, and they're moving in this direction, whereas a liberal Christian might have just been regularly throughout their life a part of a liberal mainline denomination. Would that be accurate?
Yes and no. I think often that is the case, but we also have to recognize that sometimes people that come out of a mainline or liberal background also use the term progressive Christian. In fact, there's a website devoted to progressive Christianity. I think it's called like progressivechristianity.org, if I'm not mistaken. And it is run by people who are supporters of John Shelby Spong's theological ministry. You know, he's passed on, but Spong was, I would say, one of the preeminent voices of a liberal mainline perspective, and one that was quite vocal back to his books in the 1980s, rescuing the Bible from fundamentalism, very vocal in critiquing evangelicalism and fundamentalism, but also I think jettisoning some key historic Orthodox Christian doctrines and doing so from a liberal mainline perspective, yet he uses the term progressive Christian as well. So you do have to kind of talk to individuals, find out how they're using the term. But I think what you said is generally correct, that most people who use the term are coming out of that conservative background. So you think about people like Rob Bell, Brian McLaren, the late Rachel Held Evans, Pete Enns is often associated with this movement. So people like that are coming out typically of a conservative or evangelical background, but have adopted you could say, a more progressive stance in their understanding of doctrine.
Now, why do you think that evangelicals, such as Elisa Childers and others, are so concerned about progressive Christianity? Because there have always been wings of the church that have more liberal tendencies, or there might be disagreements about certain interpretations. Why would they see progressive Christianity as such a danger?
That's a huge question. When it comes to Elisa Childers, I mean, when you read her book, Another Gospel, she says that back in, I think, about 2007 or 8, she went to a church and she was invited into a group within the church, a small group that was led by her pastor at the time, which she would later on come to call progressive Christian. And she says that that group was a catalyst for her almost losing her faith. And she looks back on that pastor essentially as having malevolent intentions to undermine historic Orthodox Christianity. And because of that, the way that Elisa Childers views progressive Christians and the progressive Christian quote unquote movement, insofar as we could talk about a movement, is that she understands it to be something which is outside of Christianity, but which wants to deceive Christians and lead them astray. Kind of the way that evangelicals have often viewed Mormonism historically, or that Mormons, especially since the 1970s, have sought to present themselves as Christianity deluxe, and yet have jettisoned historic key Orthodox doctrines in the process. She understands progressive Christians like that, and so she wants to counter this malevolent force. Now, there may be progressive Christians who fit that definition, but most people that I meet who use the term progressive Christian are actually just people working through their faith, trying to move from milk to solid food, recognizing that some of the doctrines that they grew up with in historic 20th century evangelicalism are not necessarily the same thing as mere Christianity. They're not holy writ. They're not handed down from on high. And so they've come to critique those doctrines and practices and move on to what they believe is a more fuller and faithful understanding of Christianity. So I think it's very unhelpful when people like Childers paint all these people with the brush of malevolence, saying that they're outside of Christianity altogether. Um, Rather, I think she should try to build a bridge with these people and understand how they are, for the most part, of the same faith that is shared by Alyssa Childers.
Now, from my experience, I find that the progressive Christians I've encountered definitely are not coming with these bad motives, who are trying to shipwreck people's faith or anything like that. But I will also say I have encountered some that I would I would put them in outside of Orthodox faith. They might, yes, they may have deconstructed their ideas of origins of human life and the age of the earth and eschatology and so on. But some of them continue on to maybe see Jesus as not being divine, to denying his deity, and some other things that we would place within mere Christianity. Do you have some of those concerns as well when it comes to some corners of progressive Christianity?
Yeah, I would say maybe three things here. The first thing would be that I have the same concerns about some self-confessed evangelicals. John MacArthur, for example, has endorsed what I think is the racist Hamitic myth, which associates the mark of Cain and the curse of Ham with the darkness of Black people in North America. Or T.D. Jakes, who, as I said earlier, had rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. Or someone like Kenneth Copeland, who I think is just off the rails, frankly. Or there are Christians, people like Doug Wilson, who adopts a dominionist understanding of Christianity and has downplayed the historic evil of slavery in antebellum America. I have real concerns about their theology and their practice. And there are some progressives I also have concerns about, not a question there. But it's a parity. It's not just progressive Christians. The next thing I would want to say is that when people are in error about something like the doctrine of the incarnation or the atonement or the resurrection, doesn't mean that they're all wrong. It doesn't mean that they're wicked. In fact, I could still learn all sorts of things from those people. So I need to try to understand where they're coming from and extend the golden rule that treat them and their beliefs with the same charity that I would want my own to be treated. And maybe as iron sharpens iron, we can each learn from one another, even if their doctrines place them outside of historic orthodoxy. And the final thing I would say about that, which is a point that I begin Progressive Christians Love Jesus 2 on, is I quote from Lee Strobel. Now, Lee Strobel gives the introduction to Alyssa Childers' book. And in his introduction, he says that correct doctrine is the foundation or the anchor of Christianity. And I say, no, it isn't. The anchor or the foundation of Christianity is Jesus Christ and a relationship with Jesus Christ. And if any of us are saved, it is certainly not because we've got all of our doctrinal T's crossed and I's dotted. Nobody is saved because of the adequacy of their Orthodox confession. They're saved because of the meritorious work of Jesus Christ and his Spirit dwelling within us. And it's not for me to say ultimately who's in and who's out, but just simply to recognize with grace and humility that God will save us despite many of our theological errors.
Well, that'll preach. I like that. That is a good thing. People do tend to get this impression that we're one day going to stand before God and he's going to hand us a paper with a theology exam, and we're going to have to get a certain mark correct in order to get in, rather than because of what Jesus has done. I do appreciate how you call all parts of the church to really reflect on what they're doing and what we're tolerating. It just having the label of evangelical or progressive or reformed or charismatic, that's not what's important. It's really how we are following Jesus and doing our best, and ultimately we're really responsible for our own faith and for those who maybe go in a different direction and maybe come to some interpretations that we don't agree with. Ultimately, they're going to have to answer for themselves as opposed to God asking us why we allowed them to continue on in that. So that is good. I really appreciated your book. I thought it really gave a good introduction to what was going on, and calls apologists to be more careful in how we respond to things. There's nothing wrong with responding, but we need to make sure we're representing things accurately and not creating straw men that are easy to knock down. So I appreciate you doing. Is there anything else that you would like for people to hear when in terms of how to respond to criticisms of progressive Christianity?
Well, maybe I'll just tie it in. You were just mentioning apologetics. So tied into apologetics, doubt and questioning are not always good things, but they're also not always bad things. And I grew up in a conservative evangelical tradition where there was this stigma about doubt and questioning. It was always seen as subversive. And in another one of my books I wrote, Conversations with My Inner Atheist, I say that the church, the local church, is like a sailing ship where you need ballast, but you also need sails. The ballast are like the people with certain strong convictions and never really change. But the sails are like the people who ask questions and wrestle with them, and they have doubts. And together they catch the wind and they drive the boat forward while the ballast gives the stability. And that's like a healthy church community, is that there's some people that they're kind of solid in their convictions, and there's some people who ask questions and have doubts, and they can serve each other for the sake of the kingdom. When we stigmatize certain people, such as those who call themselves progressive Christians, for having doubts and for wrestling with questions, excuse me, we don't make the church stronger. We simply force those people to take those doubts and questions underground where they fester. It's kind of like painting over a rust spot. You haven't dealt with the rust. It will come back. And if you don't allow people to have room to question and to doubt, it's like painting over rust. So you have to do that. You have to give them space within the Christian community. And I think that progressive Christianity has done that. And when you take the view that Alyssa Childers does, that, well, no, this is another gospel, it's another religion entirely, these people are malevolent, all you're doing is forcing those people to take their doubts and questions underground. And I've seen a lot of people leave Christianity altogether because evangelicalism did not give them the space to doubt or to question or to explore different theological paradigms. So I'm grateful for progressive Christianity, despite its many flaws. And I am deeply concerned about the tact of people like Alyssa Childers. I think ultimately it's counterproductive.
Well, thank you for this this quick conversation that we've had about progressive Christianity. Where can people find you online if they want to learn more about the things that you share?
So you can find me at my name, Randal Rauser, on Twitter, or if you Google it, you'll find my website. And I've got 16 books out now, so you can certainly find me like on Amazon as well. So yeah, thank you very much for Steve for having me. I really appreciated the conversation.
Yes, well, thank you, Randal.
All right, take care.